Look, thanks everyone for joining us today. It was a great opportunity to talk with people involved in regulation about the way that, well, some of the things that we see, that Emma and I see on our various borders. I'll give a bit of a rundown of the role for Victoria, but also then talk about the some more particular issues relating to regulators. The role here started in October 2018 for Victoria. So it's fairly recent for this state. And as Simon said, I have three borders. So New South Wales and South Australia are the principal borders, but Tasmania also. And we do, as a good trivia quiz, Victoria does, by an accident of history, have a land border with Tasmania, which is about 80 feet long on a tiny little island in Bass Strait. But no one lives there, so I haven't had any complaints yet from that area. The way we sort of frame the role here is a 3x3 story, so three borders. Broadly speaking, three types of issue come up, and you can characterise these in different ways, but principally for us, it's we have regulatory issues, so that's issues to do with rules and laws. We have some opportunities, and that's where people at the border want to do work together, and they need help to navigate more than one jurisdiction. But actually the largest group of issues are not strictly about rules, they're really just practice differences. They're often blamed on rules, but when we have a look under the hood, we find that there's not really, there's no rules that are particularly applying. So the types of issues I thought about, we might talk about today, particularly focusing in on those areas where regulators already have discretion. And we've seen some mixed examples, but some really good examples of good practice that demonstrate what regulators, when they're thinking about the border, what they can do within the remit that they have. There's plenty of other issues that are policy, rules, law, and regulators can obviously feed back to those, but they tend to be less in the discretion of regulators. So I won't dwell on those today, but there's certainly enough of those. One of the other things we find is a lot of the issues here, they are just as likely to arise in service provision as they are in regulation. So a lot of the lessons out of regulation are applicable to service provision agencies. And often the issues come up because the way services are delivered are just different, even if it's nothing to do with regulation. One of the questions we often get asked is, well, why bother? And it's an interesting proposition and a good question, because not every difference at the border is a problem. I mean, they might be slightly annoying, but it doesn't mean you necessarily spend effort fixing all of them. But there are many that do become quite a challenge at the border. And one of the things, and I live in a border town, and one of the things that's notable at the border, of course, is that you deal with these things every single day of every single week, of every single month, of every single year. So the impact of these things is consistent and persistent and felt very acutely. So those costs become very significant at the border. But it's not that they're not felt further away. If I can pull up slide 1 now. You should see when it comes up a photograph of Lake Hume. This is a shot I took last year. And I use this just to describe one way of describing by examples the way these border anomalies sort of crop up. So this lake is a section of the Murray River. And I took this photo from New South Wales territory. You can see across the land on the other side, that's Victorian territory. The bridge in the middle is the Bathanga Bridge. And the reason I use this photo is because this photo has three borders in it. The actual territorial border between the two states follows a particular piece of the old riverbed. So it's right down under the water. And therefore, rather impractical to use that as your border if you're going to be actively working or regulating on the waterway. But look, for most regulators, it doesn't matter. If you're doing trade licensing or liquor licensing, those sorts of things, really doesn't matter. Near enough is good enough. It is an issue for police, and there are some celebrated cases where they've had to, in fact, get adjudication as to where certain crimes happened, which means pulling out surveyors general to work out the spots. But the two areas that it does cause an issue here are obviously boating and fishing. And having a border that's somewhere buried under the water becomes a tad impractical. So there's a positive story here that in both of those cases, adjustments and arrangements have been made to put the border effectively in a place where you can operate with it. So in the case of Lake Hume, all of that water for fishing purposes is Victorian water. And there's an arrangement, long-standing arrangement, that, that Victoria takes on the fishing regulation for this whole lake, and as a bit of a trade-off, New South Wales does another lake, Lake Mulwala, further down the river. So that's a nice practical landing that the fisheries regulators came to quite some time ago. Similarly with boating, an arrangement has been come to. And on its own, it's also a good arrangement. That border is at the bridge. So if you're on the bridge, on the side of the bridge that I'm standing there, you're in Victorian boating waters, and so all the Victorian regs apply, even though in this case you'd be launching from a boat ramp in New South Wales. And if you're on the other side of the bridge, it becomes New South Wales waters. So as with fishing, that's a nice landing. I guess the unfortunate proposition here is that on this lake, fishing and boating often go together, and you could say, wouldn't it be nicer if they'd actually chosen the same boundary and made, for example, the whole thing Victorian for fishing and boating. So look, an opportunity to do more, but at least a chance to perhaps make regulation for those areas where it would be costly and inefficient to come to a neat resolution. If we can move on to the next slide, what you can see here is just a little snapshot of the types of issues that come up. So as I said, there's a lot of other issues around service provision. When this role was announced for Victoria, the premise was that it was largely going to be about sort of business regulation, trade licensing and whatnot. And there's certainly plenty of that. But as you see here, I won't work through all of these, but the range of issues actually goes quite broad, and it goes into things like mental health orders, issues around the voluntary assisted dying scheme in Victoria, domestic violence, information sharing. So it's not just your sort of traditional things that people might think of in business or trade regulation. It's right across the board. And that makes it quite interesting because it means that both myself and Emma in her role do actually see across quite a lot of areas. If you pull that slide down now, and before I go to the next one, I'll just talk a little bit about the, before I get into the practices we see. One of the questions often is, well, where do these things come from? Why do we have these anomalies? And it is true that many of the anomalies we deal with are quite long-standing and historical, I guess you'd say. But there are also some very recent ones. So unfortunately, I'd have to say, as jurisdictions, we're also still in the business of creating border anomalies. So it's not just an issue of dealing with the current stock. There's also a flow, unfortunately. The typical source of these, and I sort of tie this down to four areas, and this could be actions of regulators or policymakers or service providers. First one is ignorance of the border. And so particularly in these states where the capital cities and hence the centre of government is a long way from the border, it's unfortunately the case that often the border implications are just not even thought about when we're designing schemes and programs. Now people hopefully at least know there's a border, so there can also be acts of omission when we're designing or putting together schemes where the border is at least acknowledged, but really not dealt with properly or assumed away. We also have some issues, and there's some we're working with right now, where each party or each jurisdiction is so assured of the purity of its own best solution that it's not willing to give any ground on the other solutions. And so that can create something of an anomaly, you might say, where particularly technical standards that can be sort of strongly held and the technical experts are not willing to give a little. And the last one, and I sort of mentioned before, was the issue of assumption, where we do often find, we've come across quite a few examples where one jurisdiction was just assuming that the other jurisdiction did something in a certain way, and it may have even actively designed its program to match, but it turns out the assumption was wrong because no one ever checked. And so that's another type of source of issue. And look, there's lots of examples that we can go to in the questions, but that's really the general backdrop to this. And if I just pull up the third slide here, and I guess this comes to the nub of it, is when we do go across this variety of issues, we do see some really good practices by some regulators where they've had a go at dealing with, as best they are able, dealing with you know, the world of the border. And I've broken that into 6 items here, but it's really item 1 is simply recognizing that we have borders and that there is you know, at least the possibility that the way we do things, or the way we operate, or the way we exercise our discretions, that there might be some border implications. And so that, you know, step 1 is almost just recognize that that's there. And I guess flowing from that is then step 2, start asking, as a regulator, start asking that border question. So if we are thinking about the way we do things, or we are thinking about rearranging a program or introducing a new one, if we have a new program or a new regulator, asking that question is a simple way to start getting your head around it. And I really want to, in the Victorian context, if I can call out the new Portable Long Service Leave Authority. So there was a startup regulator not so long ago. And in that early startup stage, we sat down and spoke and talked about some of the possible border issues that they might face. And they were really open to saying, let's get up there. I mean, they were sort of based in Bendigo anyway, but let's get to the border, talk to people, meet with people, and really understand it, not just assume it, because they were facing some interesting border challenges. And that goes to number 3, is that if you're not a regulator that has people in the border area naturally, and some do, just coming to the border and meeting with people here, talking to the stakeholders, and sort of ground truthing your operation. It's interesting that there's a number of regulators we've met who are perhaps city-based, for whom that's not a natural thing to do necessarily. But those who do it, you can see straight away that they are already incorporating their those border realities, and they're asking those questions. So that simple act of doing that. And what I'd say to most jurisdictions is you have to think about the border in addition to thinking about regions, because doing regions is not quite as sufficient. It doesn't lead you to ask the border question. The next one is also investing in counterpart relationships. If you have counterparts, you don't always. Great example here of the Work Safe and Safe Work between Victoria and New South Wales. They get together regularly. They hold joint sessions, joint forums, because they're dealing with the same trades and builders along the border. Now, they have different jurisdiction, and there are some differences, but they do make a point of working together. Number 5, this is quite important, is to the extent we can recognise their practices. So this is where you might have to give a little back. You might want to just say, we prefer you did it this way, but we will recognise the next state's practice. And number 6, the last one, is some stuff will go into the world of policy. So good regulators certainly push that lesson back. So I might just hold up there and hand back to Simon.
Okay, great. Look, thank you very much for that, Luke. We've got quite a number of questions have come in already, but almost all of them would be issues that would relate to both of the commissioners. So perhaps we'll go straight on to Emma, and then we'll have questions after that. So I think that was a really good overview of the issues, but now let's move on to Emma.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for having me. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that Luke's talked about, but from a New South Wales perspective. I think I've got a slide there, thanks Adam. But also I'm relatively new to this role, and so I'm going to talk about my perspectives as coming in as a new starter, and also some of the experiences I've had prior to this this role, and how I think some of the experiences of consumer engagement with people and stakeholders can inform some of the work that you might do as regulators, but certainly is informing some of the things that we do. So not all borders are the same, and Luke spoke to that a little bit. We were established in 2012. The current cross-border Commissioner, James McTavish, was appointed in 2014. I'm the Assistant Commissioner, and I've been appointed in January this year. We assist border communities by connecting them with agencies and working with border states to understand their issues and improve outcomes. We're only a small team of 4 working with communities on the ACT, Victorian, Queensland and South Australian borders. Our predominant work is with the ACT, Victorian and Queensland borders, and that's mostly about population, but we certainly do a lot of work and speak to issues with the Broken Hill community as well. And you can see from the images that we are dealing with really diverse communities. It's economically, geographically and demographically diverse communities. And there is that old bugbear of daylight saving, which seems to be an intractable issue, and I'm not sure that's going to be in my KPIs for dealing with that over the next couple of years. But even with the urban centres of Tweed, Canberra, Albury-Wodonga, they're largely rural and regional and remote communities. That adds a layer of complexity. The issues are felt in border communities, but they're amplified. And then there's that sense of isolation from decision makers. The issues we deal with and the governance arrangements reflect the diversity of the communities and the way we deal with regulatory policy and practice issues. But we do have different arrangements across borders. So with ACT and Queensland, we have what we call our MOUs, and they're agreements for collaboration. And we're about to renew those existing agreements. There's one to come with the Victorian government. But under the MOUs, there is work plans where we agree to undertake and target specific levels of work. And we report on those annually. That keeps us and the agencies we work with accountable for the work we're doing. And we also have cross-border commissioners in New South Wales and Victoria, as you know, but we work with First Minister's departments in other states, and that works relatively well. Internally, our business planning processes are approved by Cabinet. That lends an authority to our work with the New South Wales government agencies we work with, and the MOUs and work plans add a layer of political commitment, and the work plans and annual reports keep us accountable. There's been a few attempts to resolve these anomalies in the past, but we think that the cross-border role combined with the MOUs provides a mechanism for authority, accountability, sustained attention and political agreement. We work on individual queries, but we are generally trying to resolve the root cause rather than the actual issue, individual issue itself. I sort of like to think about it in terms of we're not just fixing potholes, we're trying to understand why the pothole exists. And then sometimes you've got to realise that sometimes a pothole is just a pothole. Next slide, thanks. So I'm a new starter. I started in January 2020. At the time, our focus was going to be on new MOUs and work plans and refreshing our own strategic approach, and then COVID hit. But I have a background in working with regulated energy monopolies and advocates on improving engagement practices. But I live in a cross-border community myself. Fortunately, I also have access to good NBN, so that helps me in my engagement with communities as we all work from home. But what surprised me about this new role has been the breadth of issues. So as Luke pointed to, it's trade licensing, it's mutual recognition, working with children, point-to-point regulation, emergency services response. I came in just as the fires were finishing in New South Wales, and access access to palliative care options. The other interesting thing is that the international airport at the Gold Coast is in New South Wales, and I've not been game to ask how they apply daylight savings there. The other thing that's interesting is what can be solved without legislative or regulatory change or budget allocation, and Luke pointed to this a little bit. Sometimes there's a view that cross-border anomalies are a result of black letter law, but often it's as a result of embedded process that might work for the majority of population, but it leads to poorer outcomes for people in border communities. When you ask the question about the basis of the process, it reveals often that there's scope for change, but only if there's an appetite for change. And then the third thing that surprised me is about how surprised people are about there being cross-border issues. It's a function of our federation, and we've seen a lot of that play and how we work on that in the past month with the response to COVID. But that's as a result of state governments are often the government that's most present in our day-to-day lives. If you think about when you get into your car, you think about how many ways the state government could have been involved, from fair trading at purchase to registration to your licence and to your insurance. That can happen in every action we take in a day. So the opportunities for anomalies are enormous, and most days, for most people, that experience is felt every day. The experience might be seamless in some ways, but when things are misaligned, it can be more than inconvenient. It can cost time, money, and impact on people's quality of life. But the things that have been confirmed for me is that the relationships are key. Engagement improves authority and trust. And I'll talk a little bit more about that from sort of a practice point of view in my next couple of slides. So the next slide, thanks. So I've been thinking about, in doing this for you, I've been thinking about why we regulate. And there's plenty of technical ways to articulate why we regulate. They generally involve addressing market failures and bad behaviour on part of firms, but ultimately it's about protecting people where otherwise they might have poorer outcomes. There will be many ways in which governments decide to articulate the policy intent, and regulators will interpret and operationalise that intent differently. But there's value in reminding ourselves about why we regulate, because ultimately it's about outcomes for people, not about the myriad of ways in which we can solve the problem. For people on the borders, misaligned regulation can add further complexity to their lives, and the difference between states is unlikely to be viewed by them as a sufficient reason for the differences. So in your own practice and your own work, I challenge you to consider your own approaches on the borders. Are you taking a compliance versus an outcome approach? Can there be harmonisation of practice, if not in legislation on law, but in the way you undertake your processes to improve outcomes for people? And is there room for innovation or re-evaluation of practice? And finally, just keep it simple. There may not need to be a legislative change. Improved outcomes could result from regular planned dialogue with your counterparts across the border and with the communities that you operate with. Next slide. So Luke talked a little bit about what good regulators do on the border. I'm going to talk a little bit about what good looks like in terms of engagement from a sort of a broader level. I've spent a lot of time working with advocates and engagement experts about what it looks like. So for an example, in some monopoly sectors, consumer engagement has been mandated as a proxy for competition. But however, for all organisations, investing in how you engage with people is likely to deliver better outcomes for you and for your organisation. This is something I'm thinking about as we set our strategy for the next few years. After 8 years of operation and 6 in our current format, our approach is maturing and we're taking the opportunity to think about our own approaches. So in my experience, engagement is a dialogue, and it's the interplay between 3 elements. It's developing capacity within ourselves and within our organisations and the people our work impacts, either individuals or businesses. It's building relationships that allow for transparency, trust and authority. And finally, it's informing decision making, both the internal and the decisions that others make as a result of ours. There's lots of formal work on what effective engagement is, but I don't think it needs to be complicated, and it's not just the job for your comms unit in your organisation. As people who deal with people and process every day, the way you engage with stakeholders is key. And we all have a role to play in developing a culture in organisations that focuses on good outcomes. So I think good engagement is planned, strategic and timely. It is informed by transparent objectives. It engages stakeholders early to inspire trust and confidence, includes recognising a problem, as Luke says, recognising the border issue and making specific effort to engage hard to reach stakeholders. And in our case, that's the border stakeholders. It doesn't have to be complex, but a clarity of plan and purpose adds discipline. As part of work we do, we include our counterpart in the ACT in one of our regional leadership executives for the capital region in terms of the those people involved in frontline services in the capital region, and they participate in that quarterly meeting. So they get to work with my colleagues on issues that relate to the community, and that comes from policing, from health services to environmental services, and it means that we're all sharing issues and are on the same page. The other thing is that you invest in good practice and you be curious. So you may have people in your own business that can talk to you about how you can better reach people. You need to ensure leadership are part of the conversation, and that provides people that you're working with an opportunity to see that your senior leadership and decision makers are part of the conversation. And you need to ask questions about how existing regulation is working in practice and what works and what doesn't. And finally, I think we've lost a slide. Be transparent and accountable. Good practice is that you're transparent about what you can change and acknowledge what you hear and how you have responded to what you've heard. It doesn't always require agreement. Like any conversation between people with different concerns and goals, there's lots of possible outcomes. A compromise might be found, there might need to be more work, and you might need to agree to disagree. This is challenging and it's uncomfortable for us all, but it does lead to better outcomes. And at a time when trust and confidence in institutions is at its lowest, these uncomfortable things are important for us to do. Final slide, thanks. Now, we did sort of say we weren't going to talk much about the pandemic, but given that the majority of my time in my new role has been dealing with cross-border issues and the pandemic, I thought I'd touch on those a little bit. So at this stage, Queensland, Tasmania, South Australia, Western Australia, Northern Territory have movement restrictions, and I think that's an important distinction across state and territory borders, whilst New South Wales, Victoria and the AC don't. They're public health orders that are mixed in application but largely consistent. We did get a question, can I cross the border to pick up a rabbit from Melbourne? The answer was that it was unlikely to qualify for essential travel, even though there were no restrictions on entering into Victoria. But if the person had been a professional rabbit breeder or a farmer, or picking it up from a person in vulnerable circumstances, it may well have been essential. The details matter. My observations is that the clarity of communication has been important, and people largely want to do the right thing, and that exemptions have allowed people to continue to operate within the confines of challenging circumstances. It's not BAU, and when there are already challenges, border restrictions sometimes amplified. But I did want to share a small story about good practice. It's not really cross-border, but it's from one of our cross-border communities in Queensland, and it relates to the circumstances of regional communities in this time. So we have a small manufacturing business in Goondiwindi was due to be inspected for a specialised certification the week that more restrictions were put in place on travel in general. The firm that does the inspections still planned to drive from Brisbane, where there were COVID cases, to Goondiwindi, where there wasn't. By practice, a site visit was required, but the factory operator was unwilling to put staff at risk of exposure if there was another way. In short, The auditor, the regulator, and the factory operator worked together to find a solution in a 48-hour period that allowed for an inspection to be done via online web platform. By innovating an approach that still allowed for compliance and an appropriate inspection, but the outcome is that a small business can now operate in the way they want to, and in a time of drought and in these times, it gives them a cause for optimism about their business. So I'm just going to wrap up pretty quickly, but there's 3 final things I just wanted to add. We're not all spectators to this, so I wanted you to consider a few things. The first one is first do no harm. Every action you do right now can and will reflect on your organisations. A lot of communities have gone through a lot of trauma in the last 12 to 18 months, particularly those from droughts, fires and COVID. And so are you helping communities operate in the current environment? Understanding what the needs of your stakeholders are right now and the timing of outreach is critical to avoid appearing tone deaf. Like my example, you may need to make decisions about what can wait or what you can do differently. People are crying out for accurate, timely information. You still need to be communicating and reassuring your stakeholders about what continues, what might change, and providing clear guidance on who people can contact for more information. And finally, look past the near term. Whilst this is difficult and it will remain to be difficult for some time, there are opportunities from this, and that's what we're thinking about. We've largely operated in a face-to-face engage directly with stakeholders. That's a lot of travel, lots of waiting in airports or kilometres driven, but this is a new normal for us. And we're thinking about how we have a hybrid approach in the future. And that might represent an opportunity for you to extend your engagement with and across borders as well. Thanks very much, guys, and I look forward to your questions.
So the first question we had, which was about, is how do jurisdictions without cross-border commissioners solve their regulatory conflict problems? Are there any good coordination mechanisms that people can suggest? Perhaps if I hand over to you for that one, Luke.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. So in my case, of the 2 major jurisdictions, obviously South Australia doesn't have a cross-border commissioner. What I've done there, and it was probably fortunate I'd worked in South Australia a number of years, but I basically formed a connection with a couple of unofficial counterparts, one being Matt Butlin, the chair of South Australia's Productivity Commission, and the other being South Australia's Public Service Commissioner. So, and I think, as Emma said, even where they have MOUs, that it's typically a connection into the the DPC or equivalent, and that's what we did for South Australia, is form a connection that way. And then often the work is sometimes just signposting, so you can find the right pathway, but it's also about finding a pathway that has some authority in that jurisdiction. I mean, there's lots of people that you call and connect with in South Australia, which is great for finding information, and you want to do that, but it's also useful to have a sort of put the case and build the connection in the centre to pick it up. So that you can at least make that connection with some authority. Emma might have some observations on her MOU partners.
Yeah, I think how we've managed it from our part is with putting in some key priorities within the work plans under our MOU, and that gives us some agency and authority to work with agencies on how to resolve some of those issues. And then we do public reports on so we publicly report the work plan and we publicly report on the outcomes. So when you're doing that, adds a level of discomfort and encouragement to resolve the issues.
Excellent. The second most popular question we had was, are there any particular cross-border issues for Indigenous communities whose traditional lands and boundaries predate states by more than 60,000 years? So again, I might start with you, Luke, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's a good question. There certainly are, and for the very reason laid out in the question, that those borders are somewhat, well, they're arbitrary at the best of times, but they're certainly arbitrary in relation to Indigenous people. And unfortunately, we do find, examples right across the board where services are arranged on a state basis, typically, and therefore the service suddenly stops and starts at the border and becomes a different service, even though the community is one community. In some respect, I mean, it's actually the experience also of just anyone who lives on the border, but particularly for Indigenous people, that the movement, which is quite natural over those borders, can be quite challenging when some of those services and systems do stop. And that, curiously enough, that includes some federal services. So we have found that even without the involvement of states, there have been some federal services that have been, if you like, state aligned and suffer the same experience.
Excellent. Emma, I wonder if you could just, there's a question here about how do we shift head office thinking so they're more cognizant of border issues. I think Luke gave us a pretty reasonable list of why these issues arise, the causes of them. But Emma, have you had any experience in how you shift head office thinking on these issues?
In previous kind of roles, making it part of the strategy is actually how you shift head office roles. And to those who have influence over strategy and work and business plans, that's an important way of keeping people honest, making that sort of engagement with border communities and recognising the problem. But to the other point, and Luke mentioned it as well, is asking your leadership teams to attend, to visit those communities and hear what they have to say, because the light switches on something. If you're not exposed to that every day, you're not going to fully understand the depth of the issue. But making it exposing leadership teams to part of it is important. Again, what we've done is included in our work plans, and that way the department secretary or the head of your organisation is ultimately responsible to the minister for that, and that means that lends some focus.
I think, Emma, you were explaining to me earlier that the work plans are commitments by each of the relevant entities, not by the Commissioner. They're not your work plan, they're the work plans of all of the agencies across New South Wales to address.
Correct. That's right. So they're not for James and I to be ticking every box for every department. Our skills aren't that broad or wide, but certainly it's about working with the agencies and identifying where they can be involved in solving the problems.
Okay. Look, thank you. What we're going to do now is we're going to close the formal part of the proceedings, do a bit of a wrap up. But after that, we're going to have Emma and Luke going to stay on the line on the webinar to be able to answer a few more of the questions that we've got that are still sitting there. We've had about 180 people join this webinar today, which is a fantastic level of participation and which highlights why this is a useful approach for us, the NRCoP. We were struggling to think about how we're going to manage this when we all got constrained to our homes and offices. So we've got a series of webinars coming up. You'll see on the slide in front of you, there's learning to be better regulators, and that's the New Zealand experience, the G-Reg journey, and already a high level of people signing on for that one. We've got what possibly could go wrong, regulating the professions. That's on the 19th of May. So we're on about a 3-week cycle at this stage. And the third one we've got outlined there, which are all available to register on the NRCoP webpage, is how do we know we're good at what we're doing? So measuring regulatory performance, which is a topic that's come up a lot in the surveys that we've done of our members over the last year or so. So they're 3 upcoming webinars. They're all available to register on the NRCoP webpage on the ANZSOG website. And also we've got an international one that possibly coming up shortly. So we'll look forward to being able to announce that shortly. So thank you for all your participation. After the webinar's closed, you'll receive a brief evaluation survey. And as always, we really welcome feedback. Unless you want to talk about my ability to pronounce Maori, that's not feedback we need. But we're looking forward for feedback on how useful you found the session. So those of you who want to sign off at this stage, that's fine. For the rest of you, we'll continue now with a few more questions for Emma and Luke. So the next question that was most popular was, do the communities in cross-border areas such as Albury-Wodonga actively demand greater harmonisation of regulations, or do they accept that's the way it is in a federation? Perhaps, Emma, you could start off with that.
Well, I think Luke will have a lot to say, given he lives in that community. I think, though, that I don't think they accept the status quo, but they're finding their workarounds. And these, as Luke has said, these are persistent issues, and at times they're annoying, but sometimes they often they actually impact on quality of life. So I think with some of the continued kind of advocacy from stakeholders and communities on these issues, I don't think they just generally accept the status quo. I think the amount of times I still hear about daylight saving, I don't think people are still accepting the status quo there. But we're trying to, resolve the issues to the extent that we can on these issues.
And Emma, you're in Queanbeyan, so you're on the ACT New South Wales border.
Correct, yes.
So if you get a taxi from Canberra Airport, you're doing interstate travel.
I certainly am. In fact, if I walk across a bridge about 2 kilometres away from me, I'm crossing the border. Excellent.
Okay. Another question which we had, which is surprisingly popular. So Rachel Can sent this one in. She's interested to know whether the commissioners have had to tackle the issues of regulating the movements of bees across borders. Luke, do you want to start with that?
No, I haven't had bee movement raised. I've had other issues around livestock. I'm aware that the big bee movement is in fact the largest livestock move in the country, just by the number of head. But no, bees itself hasn't come up. I have, there's a few issues around with in that agricultural world, but I'd have to say, thankfully, given that's the world I came from, asking the border question is at least a fairly regular thing in the world of agriculture and biosecurity, because it's obviously so border focused, I suppose. Doesn't make it perfect or without fault, but there are certainly not as many issues come up in that world as get raised with me in others.
Last year I travelled from South Australia to Western Australia by car, and I think it was the most rigorous inspection I've ever had crossing a border. I think if Border Force were as rigorous at that at the airport, there'd be huge queues. So yes, I think it particularly it's an agricultural focus. Question we've had as well is, given we know all the problems that you've highlighted of a federation, some of the challenges, does either of you got any examples of where it's been a positive advantage, these differences?
I think if you go to that idea of competitive federalism, I think that's the term, isn't it? Which is the notion that one of the advantages is that there are different models tried, and everyone can learn off everyone else, and in theory, over time, you actually get improvements, and I think that's certainly true. I guess if you're a resident of a border area, you get to experience the pleasure through the learning process, and so that's the burden that we carry. But you more generally, I think there's something in that. The one small example we have, which is currently a learning process, is it might have been on my slide, was there are different standards for school buses, and of course on the border the school buses drive back and forth, and there are at various points in time there are differences in what signs you have to have on the bus and the way the lights flash and whatnot. And so, you know, there's an example, and I think through last year and this year, we're actually starting to see a convergence between the two states on that. Hopefully, because there's presumably no evidence to, you know, see that there's a great difference between whether it flashes 80 times a minute or 90 times a minute. But you know, you do get those experiences tend to flush out, and that's usually because some of the, in that case, the bus operators are sort of standing there saying, "Well, isn't this ridiculous? We have to wire our bus 2 different ways, spend an extra $1,000 to do it, and the outcomes don't seem to be any different."
Emma, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I guess I've just been reflecting on it in terms of if we see, say, the work of the National Cabinet that's been going on for the past sort of 5 weeks, it's allowed each state to meet the needs of different communities that are geographically located differently and have different needs. And so each state has been able to make its own decisions in order to protect its own people, but work within a cooperative arrangement. And so I think there's some things that we can learn from the National Cabinet process that might be another one of the opportunities after we've sort of in the longer term. And I think it's been a good example about how diverse communities and diverse states can still have their needs met, but it's done in a cooperative way.
Okay, no, interesting point. I have one question here. Someone, Mary Ivick, asked, you stress the importance of relationships. What are the relationships that matter most in your work, or are there a range of relationships that matter? Might start off with you, Luke, since you've had the most time to develop the relationships in your current role, and then perhaps cross to you, Emma, if that's okay.
Yeah, it's a good question, because there are a lot of you know, stakeholders involved right around each, you know, whichever borders one's dealing with. And I guess if you can sort of almost pitch it 2 ways, if you're looking at issue by issue, which is only one way to look at it, you get a lot of players involved and a lot of stakeholders, but that can be very large and unmanageable. But if you look through the threads of all the issues that come up, you quickly see there are key players along the border. So your local government leaders, your chambers of commerce, and local MPs, border MPs can be quite important on both sides. It doesn't matter which side they're on. And then the other part is back in the centre, having a relationship, or as best a relationship you can, with the key players. And that's both in the departments or the agencies, so as close to the top as you can get, but also the ministers. And I know in both cases we use the pathways through ministers' offices to sometimes I guess you might say, do a pull through of an issue, because they can do that with a request to their department. But it does, when you look at all the players, you can end up with a very long list of stakeholders to engage with. And one of the questions then, a practical question when you're only got a very small office, is how do you do that efficiently and let people on board? And I think one of the issues we look at, and I've looked at, is you actually want the border communities over time to be empowered to pursue their issues themselves, or to speak up for themselves, and not only be reliant on what a commissioner might be able to provide. So, because that's a far more effective way that, like on the borders I deal with, we've got 300,000 people, give or take, on those borders. So it's more effective to have 300,000 people pursuing the matter than to just have 1 or 2.
Emma, if you don't have anything to add to that, I think what we'll do now, we're nearly at 12 o'clock, so we'll wrap up. I'd like to thank both Luke and Emma for taking the time to present today on this really important issue, and for so many Australians. I mean, not just people who live in the border regions, it can affect people across every one of our jurisdictions, and there are obviously border issues between Australia and New Zealand as well. So Adam, I think, is going to put up the slide just as a reminder of the upcoming events. So I encourage you all to register for those upcoming events. I thank you, all of the participants from right around Australia and New Zealand, for participating and for all of the really useful questions that we had. So thank you for those of you that engaged with the Slido app to provide those questions. And we look forward to having a good level of participation in the next session, which is on Tuesday, the 5th of May. So register now. So thanks again. Bye then.